That night, a forgotten mail-order bride had no supper until the cowboy shared his plate. Sometimes the Lord puts folks in our path just when we need them most. Back in 1882, in a little frontier town called Cedar Ridge, two lonely souls were about to discover that the simplest acts of Christian kindness can bloom into something far more precious than either could have imagined. The evening shadows stretched long across the weathered porch of Henderson's Mercantile, where Clara Whitfield sat with her back pressed against the rough-hewn planks. Her fingers traced the dented rim of an empty tin cup, counting the same 3 pennies in her worn leather coin purse for what felt like the 100th time that day. The coins clinked softly together, not near enough for even a piece of hardtack. Through the amber glow of the store's kerosene lamps, she could see Mrs. Henderson arranging bolts of calico on the counter, occasionally glancing toward the window with a disapproving shake of her graying head. Clara straightened her shoulders and smoothed the wrinkles from her faded blue dress, determined to maintain whatever dignity the good Lord had left her after 3 long days of waiting for a man who clearly wasn't coming. The main street of Cedar Ridge bustled with the day's final activities. Ranchers loaded supplies into their farm wagons. Children chased each other between the hitching posts, and the saloon across the way had already begun to fill with cowhands finished with their work. Clara watched it all from her shadowed corner. Invisible to most folks passing by, just another piece of frontier furniture that had seen considerably better days. Her stomach twisted with a familiar pang, and she pressed her hand against the worn fabric of her dress to quiet the rumbling. When she reckoned no one was looking, she lifted the tin cup to her lips and licked away the morning dewdrops that had collected on its surface. The tiny drops of moisture provided mighty little relief, but they were free as air. Across the dusty thoroughfare, Silas Stone dismounted from his bay gelding with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his 28 years in the saddle. He looped the reins around the hitching post and brushed the trail dust from his leather chaps, his attention caught by the slight figure huddled on Henderson's porch. Something about the woman's careful posture, the way she held herself upright despite her obvious distress, made him pause mid-step. He'd seen plenty of folks down on their luck in frontier towns, but there was a quiet dignity about this one that spoke of better circumstances not so long past. Clara became aware of his scrutiny and lifted her chin, meeting his gaze across the street with eyes that held no shame, only a bone-deep weariness that seemed far too heavy for someone who appeared to be barely past 20. Silas touched the brim of his hat in a respectful nod before turning toward the Mercantile's entrance. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scents of leather, tobacco, and pickle brine. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her inventory with the practiced smile of a shopkeeper. "Evening, Silas. What brings you to town so late in the day?" "Need some supplies, Mrs. Henderson." He glanced toward the window where Clara sat. "And I'm fixing to get 2 bowls of that beef stew you keep warm in the back. Extra cornbread if you've got it to spare." The older woman's eyebrows rose as she followed his gaze. "Expecting company for supper?" Silas simply nodded toward the window and placed 30 cents on the counter. More than fair payment for 2 simple meals in a territory where money stretched thin and Christian kindness stretched even thinner. Empty plates and empty promises. There's something powerful about watching a person's dignity shine through their darkest hour. In my years of storytelling, I've come to believe that the truest measure of character isn't found in prosperity, but in how folks conduct themselves when life has stripped them down to nothing but their inner strength. This tale begins with such a moment, a young woman sitting alone on a frontier porch, her world reduced to 3 pennies and an empty tin cup, yet holding herself with the grace of a queen. What strikes me most about Clara's story is how quickly circumstances can change a person's life. One day, you're a respected schoolteacher with a secure future. The next, you're stranded in a strange town with nothing but the clothes on your back and promises that turn to dust. But sometimes, when we least expect it, the Lord sends along exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Sometimes salvation comes not with trumpets and fanfare, but with the simple sharing of a warm meal and the quiet recognition of one soul by another. The evening shadows stretched long across the weathered porch of Henderson's Mercantile, where Clara Whitfield sat counting her last 3 pennies, with the careful precision of a woman who knew exactly how little stood between her and complete destitution. The tin cup in her lap caught the dying light, its dented surface reflecting her hollow cheeks and the dark circles that had settled under her eyes like bruises. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her keys jingling with the authority of a woman ready to close up shop for the day. She glanced at Clara with the sort of look reserved for stray cats that had overstayed their welcome. "Store's closing now, Miss—" Clara's fingers tightened around the pennies until their edges bit into her palm. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." But understanding and having somewhere to go were 2 entirely different things. As Mrs. Henderson turned the key in the lock with a decisive click, Clara felt the last door of opportunity closing with it. The main street of Cedar Ridge was already emptying, respectable folks heading home to supper tables laden with the sort of abundance she could barely remember. Her stomach chose that moment to voice its complaint with a growl so loud it might have been heard clear across the street. Clara pressed her hand against the worn fabric of her dress, willing her body to be still, to maintain the dignity that was all she had left in this world. That's when she noticed the cowboy. He sat astride a bay gelding near the hitching post across the way. But he wasn't looking at the mercantile or checking his gear like most men would. He was looking straight at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Even in the fading light, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself in the saddle, not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of a man who'd earned his place in the world through honest work. Clara lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. She wouldn't cower, wouldn't look away in shame, no matter how low her circumstances had fallen. Whatever the stranger saw when he looked at her, she was determined it wouldn't be defeat. The cowboy dismounted with fluid grace and tied his horse to the rail. His spurs rang against the wooden sidewalk as he approached Henderson's door. But instead of entering, he paused and tipped his hat in her direction. "Evening, miss." His voice carried the drawl of a man born to wide-open spaces, rough around the edges but respectful. Clara inclined her head in acknowledgement, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. "Mighty fine evening for sitting on a porch," he continued, as if there were nothing unusual about finding a well-dressed woman camped outside a closed mercantile with nothing but a tin cup and 3 pennies to her name. "Indeed it is," Clara managed, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. The cowboy studied her face in the lamplight that spilled from the store window, and Clara had the strangest feeling he could see straight through to her soul past the carefully maintained posture and the stubborn tilt of her chin to the frightened woman beneath. "I don't suppose you've had your supper yet?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara's pride warred with the gnawing emptiness in her belly, with the knowledge that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 full days. "I'm not particularly hungry," she lied. The cowboy's mouth quirked up at one corner, not mocking but understanding, as if he recognized the sort of pride that would rather starve than accept charity from a stranger. "Well now, that's a shame," he said, jingling the coins in his pocket. "Because I'm powerful hungry myself, and Mrs. Henderson makes the finest beef stew this side of Denver. Seems a terrible waste to eat alone when there's pleasant company to be had." Clara stared at him, this rough-edged angel who'd appeared out of nowhere with an offer that might save her life, delivered with enough courtesy to preserve her dignity. For the first time in 3 days, she felt tears threaten behind her eyes. "I couldn't impose, no imposition at all, miss. Just 2 weary travelers sharing a meal and maybe some conversation. Nothing more complicated than that." As he spoke, the wonderful aroma of beef stew began drifting from the mercantile's back room where Mrs. Henderson kept a pot simmering for late customers. Clara's stomach responded with another audible growl, and this time she was too grateful to be embarrassed. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Stone. Silas Stone." He touched his hat brim again. "And you are Clara Whitfield. Well then, Miss Whitfield, what do you say we see about getting some of that stew before Mrs. Henderson decides to close up her kitchen too?" Clara looked into his eyes. Kind eyes. She realized, the sort that belonged to a man who'd known hardship himself and recognized it in others. Slowly, she nodded. "I'd be much obliged, Mr. Stone." But as Silas Stone turned toward the mercantile door, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that accepting this meal would change everything. She just wasn't sure if that change would be her salvation or her ruin. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. The sharing of salt and bread. Steam rose from the ceramic bowl as Silas stepped onto the porch, the rich scent of beef and onions cutting through the evening air like a promise. Clara's stomach betrayed her with an audible growl that made her press her lips together tight. He set the bowl on the weathered planks between them and lowered himself to sit a respectful 3 feet away, close enough to share the meal, but far enough to preserve her dignity. The cornbread, wrapped in checkered cloth, followed with a soft thump. "I can't—" Clara's voice caught like a fishhook in her throat. "I don't have money to—" "Didn't ask for payment." Silas unwrapped his own portion, steam fogging the air between them. Clara stared at the bowl. The broth caught the lamplight from inside the store, golden and thick with chunks of meat and carrots. Her hands trembled as she lifted the wooden spoon, the carved handle smooth against her palm. The first taste made her eyes flutter closed. Salt and pepper, bay leaves, the deep richness of slow-cooked beef. She had to force herself to eat slowly, to savor rather than devour, though every instinct screamed at her to empty the bowl in desperate gulps. They ate without speaking. Silas broke his cornbread into careful pieces, soaking them in the broth. Clara watched his hands calloused from rope work, scarred along the knuckles where barbed wire had left its mark, but steady and sure as a rock. "Thomas Whitmore never came." The words escaped before she could catch them. "3 days now." Silas nodded, chewing thoughtfully. A piece of cornbread crumbled between his fingers. "Had promises broken myself. Hurt's different than other kinds of pain." The admission hung between them like smoke from a dying campfire. Clara scraped the last of the broth from her bowl, reluctant to let the meal end. Her stomach had stopped its gnawing complaints, but the warmth spreading through her chest had nothing to do with the food. "Why?" she asked. Silas wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and studied her face in the flickering light. "Same reason you kept your dignity sitting on this porch instead of begging door to door." Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, keys jingling in her weathered hand like coins in a collection plate. "Closing up now, folks." The metal keys caught the lamplight as she turned them in the lock with a decisive click. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the reality settled over her like a heavy quilt. The store was closed. The street was emptying. The church bells had already chimed 7 o'clock, and she had nowhere to go. Silas rose to his feet, brushing crumbs from his pants. He looked down at Clara, still sitting with her empty bowl, and she saw something shift in his expression, a decision forming behind his weathered features. "My family's ranch needs help with preserving season," he said quietly. "Room and board for honest work." Clara looked up at him, searching his face for the catch that had to be there somewhere. But what if there wasn't one? Under stars and new promises. Clara studied Silas's face in the amber glow from Henderson's window. The lamplight carved deep shadows under his cheekbones. But his eyes held no deception she could detect. Her fingers tightened around the empty bowl until her knuckles went white. Just work. The words scraped her throat raw. Nothing else expected. My mother runs the house. She'll set the terms, not me. The honesty in his voice made Clara's chest tighten like a drawstring pouch. She'd heard such promises before, written in letters perfumed with false sweetness and signed with flourishes that meant less than nothing. But this man's calloused hands and sun-weathered skin spoke of labor, not lies. Clara rose on unsteady legs, her body protesting the sudden movement after hours of sitting. I can cook, clean, mend proper. Used to teach school back in Ohio before. She let the sentence die like smoke on the wind. Silas nodded toward his bay gelding. Farm wagons around back. The horse stamped and snorted as they approached, leather harness creaking with each movement. Clara's single traveling bag sat light in her hands, everything she owned in this world, fitting into one worn valise with brass corner fittings. Silas took it from her without asking and secured it under the canvas cover with practiced efficiency. The wagon seat creaked as she settled beside him, the sound sharp in the evening air. The quilted lap blanket he handed her smelled of wood smoke and prairie sage scents that spoke of home fires and wide open spaces. Silas clicked his tongue, and the horse stepped forward into the gathering darkness. Cedar Ridge fell away behind them, its scattered lights growing small and distant like fallen stars. Why help me? Clara's breath made small white clouds in the cooling air. Silas adjusted the leather reins in his gloved hands, the sound crisp as autumn leaves. Same reason you kept your dignity sitting on that porch instead of begging. The answer settled something loose in Clara's chest. She pulled the blanket tighter and watched the landscape roll past endless grass, silvered by moonlight. Distant hills black against the star-scattered sky like cutouts made from dark paper. My brother died of fever last winter, Silas said, his voice barely audible over the creak of wheels and harness leather. Family's been struggling since then. Ma and my sister-in-law Beth worked themselves near to death trying to keep up with preserving and all the household tasks. Clara heard the weight in his words, not self-pity, but the simple statement of a man carrying more than his fair share. I'm sorry for your loss. Silas nodded once, sharp and final as a door closing. The wagon rolled through a shallow creek, water splashing up between the wooden spokes with a sound like scattered coins. Clara gripped the seat as they climbed the far bank, her body swaying with each bump and dip. Above them, the Milky Way spread like scattered flour across black canvas. This arrangement, Clara said carefully, testing each word. It's temporary. Understood. But something in the way he said it made her glance at his profile. His jaw was set firm as granite, and his hands held the reins with the confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was heading and why. In the distance, yellow light flickered between dark shapes that gradually resolved into buildings. A farmhouse, a barn, outbuildings arranged around a central yard like pieces on a checkerboard. Smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air, carrying the scent of burning oak. That's home, Silas said. Clara leaned forward, studying the homestead with eyes that had grown accustomed to disappointment. Split-log construction, a wide porch, windows glowing with warm kerosene light. It looked solid, permanent, nothing like the tent cities and ramshackle buildings she'd grown accustomed to during her journey west. The horses' hooves changed rhythm as they turned into the yard, shifting from the hollow thump of hard-packed road to the softer sound of barnyard earth. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. Through the kitchen window, she could see the silhouette of a woman moving about with quick, efficient gestures. A coffee pot sat on the stove, steam rising from its spout. Dishes clinked together as someone, Beth, perhaps cleared away the remnants of supper. Suddenly, the reality hit her like a physical blow that knocked the breath from her lungs. She was about to meet Silas Stone's family, and they had no earthly idea she was coming. The kitchen door opened, spilling golden light across the porch boards, and Clara realized with a jolt of pure terror that her new life was about to begin, whether she was ready or not. But was she walking into salvation, or had she just traded one kind of trouble for another? Morning light on new ground. Martha Stone stood in the kitchen doorway like a sentinel, her gray hair pinned back severe as winter, her weathered hands gripping a dish rag that had seen better decades. The lamplight caught the sharp angles of her face as she studied Clara with the measuring look of a woman who'd survived 40 years on the frontier by trusting her instincts over pretty words. "Ma, this is Clara Whitfield," Silas said, helping Clara down from the wagon. "She needs work, and we need help with preserving season." Martha's eyes traveled from Clara's worn traveling dress to the single valise in Silas's hands, cataloging everything with the thoroughness of a livestock appraiser. "Can you make bread that won't break teeth?" The blunt question caught Clara off guard. "Yes, ma'am. I believe so." Believing and doing are different things entirely. Martha turned and walked back into the kitchen, leaving the door open behind her. "Come on, then. Let's see what you're made of." The kitchen smelled of lye soap and yesterday's biscuits, with undertones of wood smoke from the cast-iron stove that dominated one corner. A younger woman with auburn hair twisted into a practical bun looked up from washing dishes, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. "This is Beth, my daughter-in-law," Martha said without preamble. "Beth, this is Clara. She'll be helping with the work." Beth dried her hands on her apron and offered a smile that reached her eyes. "Welcome, Clara. I hope you don't mind jumping right in tomorrow's washing day. And we've got preserving to start." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The normalcy of it all, the domestic routine, the assumption that she belonged here made her chest ache with something she was afraid to name. Martha opened a wooden crock and examined the sourdough starter inside, poking it with a clean finger. "This needs tending. You ever worked with starter before?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother kept one for 20 years back in Ohio." "Good." Martha pushed the crock toward Clara. "Mix it proper and set it by the stove. We'll see how your bread turns out come morning." Clara rolled up her sleeves and set to work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she stirred the mixture. The starter bubbled and frothed, alive and healthy, reminding her of better times when bread-making was a comfort rather than a test. Martha watched every movement, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When Clara wiped the rim of the crock clean and covered it with a damp cloth, the older woman gave a barely perceptible nod. "Beth, show her to the back room. She can sleep there tonight." The back room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered by a quilt that looked hand-stitched. A wash basin sat on a wooden stand, and pegs on the wall served for hanging clothes. Clara set her valise on the bed and turned to find Beth standing in the doorway. "Don't mind Martha," Beth said quietly. "She's been running this place single-handed since my husband died. Takes her time warming up to new folks." "I understand. I'm grateful for any chance to prove myself." Beth's expression softened. "You look dead on your feet. There's clean water in the pitcher and soap in the dish. Rest up tomorrow comes early on a working ranch." After Beth left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence wash over her. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of voices in the kitchen, Martha and Silas discussing something in low tones. She caught fragments. "Can't afford another mouth." And, "Give her a chance." Clara's stomach clenched. She pulled writing paper from her valise and dipped the steel pen in ink, composing a letter to her sister back in Ohio. Dear Margaret, I have found employment with a family named Stone near Cedar Ridge. The work is honest and the people seem decent. Too soon to say more than that. But I wanted you to know I am safe and have shelter. Your sister, Clara. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her reticule to post when next she got to town. Outside her window, an owl hooted in the darkness, its call lonely and wild. Clara blew out the candle and lay back on the narrow bed, still fully dressed. The quilt smelled of lavender and honest work, reminding her of home in ways that made her throat tighten. She was drifting toward sleep when footsteps crossed the kitchen floor above her head. The back door opened and closed with a soft click. Through her window, she could see Silas walking toward the barn, his shoulders set with the weight of whatever Martha had said to him. Clara pressed her face to the glass, trying to read his posture in the moonlight. Was he having second thoughts? Had Martha convinced him that bringing her here was a mistake as she watched? Silas stopped halfway to the barn and turned back toward the house, his face tilted up as if searching the windows. For a moment, Clara thought he was looking directly at her, though she knew the darkness would hide her from view. Then he continued toward the barn, and Clara was left wondering what tomorrow would bring and whether she'd be here to see it. But as she finally closed her eyes, one question burned in her mind like a brand. What exactly had Martha Stone said to make her son walk away with such heavy steps? Hands working, hearts opening. The root cellar smelled of earth and apples, cool air rising from the stone-lined pit like breath from a cave. Clara descended the wooden steps with a kerosene lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls, its flame flickering with each movement. Split oak baskets lined the shelves, some already filled with potatoes sorted by size, others waiting empty like open mouths. Silas followed, carrying a wooden crate of apples from the orchard. His boots scraped against the packed dirt floor as he set the box down near the sorting table with a solid thump. Clara lifted the lamp higher, examining the fruit for soft spots and wormholes with the critical eye of someone who understood that winter survival depended on careful selection. These need separating, she said, turning a red delicious in her palm. The apple's skin was taut and unblemished, firm to the touch. Good ones for winter storage, damaged ones for immediate use or cider pressing. She reached for a basket at the same moment Silas did. Their fingers brushed against the woven rim, rough calluses meeting soft skin like flint striking steel. Both hands stilled. Clara felt the warmth of his touch spread up her arm, her pulse jumping beneath her wrist like a startled rabbit. Silas pulled his hand back first, the basket creaking as it settled. "You've done this before?" Clara's throat tightened around the words. She picked up an apple, testing its firmness with her thumb, feeling for the give that would indicate rot starting from within. "Ohio Farm. Before teaching took me to town." The lamp flame flickered as a draft moved through the cellar, sending their shadows dancing across the stone walls like spirits. Clara sorted methodically perfect apples in one basket, bruised ones in another, the truly damaged ones set aside for the pigs. Silas worked beside her, their movements falling into rhythm without discussion, like dancers who'd practiced the steps before. "Winter's coming early this year," Silas said, examining a particularly large Gravenstein. "All the signs are pointing that way." Clara glanced at him, noting how the lamplight caught the gray threads in his dark hair. "What signs?" "Woolly caterpillars thicker than usual. Squirrels gathering nuts 2 weeks ahead of normal. Horses growing their winter coats already. And it's barely September." He placed the apple in the good basket with careful precision. "Ma taught me to read such things when I was knee-high to a grasshopper." The simple mention of his mother sent a flutter through Clara's chest, like a moth against window glass. Martha Stone had been watching her all week through tasks and meals, measuring her worth through bread that rose properly and stew that didn't burn. Clara sensed approval growing like green shoots after rain, but hadn't dared assume anything permanent. Above them, footsteps crossed the kitchen floor in the brisk pattern Clara had learned meant Beth was starting the evening meal. The smell of frying bacon began to drift down through the cellar entrance, making Clara's mouth water despite the substantial lunch they'd shared. Clara reached for another apple, her sleeve catching on a protruding nail. The fabric tore with a soft ripping sound that seemed loud as thunder in the enclosed space. She examined the damage, a 3-inch tear along the seam of her only good work dress, the one she'd been saving for Sundays. Here, Silas pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, the cotton soft and worn from many washings. Temporary fix until you can mend it proper. His fingers brushed her wrist as he helped tie the cloth around the tear. Clara's pulse hammered under his touch, and she caught the scent of his skin, lye, soap, and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her breath catch in her chest like a fishhook. The cellar door creaked above them on hinges that needed oiling. "Silas, you down there." Martha Stone's voice carried a note of inquiry that suggested she knew exactly where he was and with whom he was spending his time. "Yes, Ma. Sorting the last of the Gravensteins." "Supper's ready. Both of you come up and wash before the food gets cold." Clara's hands trembled as she set down the apple she'd been examining. The simple inclusion in Martha's call, "both of you," carried more weight than a written invitation to Sunday dinner. They climbed the steps together, Silas holding the lamp to light her way up the narrow staircase. At the top, he held out his hand to help her navigate the final step. Clara hesitated, then placed her palm in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and sure as bedrock. The kitchen smelled of fried chicken and fresh biscuits, with undertones of butter and honey that spoke of abundance after lean times. Martha stood at the stove with her back straight as a fence post, but Clara caught the softening around her eyes that hadn't been there when she first arrived. Beth set plates on the table with quick efficiency, her movements creating a symphony of domestic sounds, china against wood, silverware chiming together. "Wash up at the pump," Martha said without turning around. "Clara, there's a clean towel on the hook by the back door." Outside, the hand pump squeaked as Silas worked the handle with steady strokes. Cold water gushed into the tin basin, and Clara cupped her hands to splash her face. The shock of it made her gasp, driving away the warmth of the cellar and the memory of his touch. Silas pumped water over his own hands, scrubbing with the bar of lye soap that sat in a wooden dish. "Been thinking about expanding the chicken coop before winter sets in proper, adding maybe a dozen more hens." Clara blinked at him, water dripping from her chin onto her torn sleeve. He was asking her opinion as if she had a permanent stake in the decision, as if her thoughts mattered to the future of this place and these people. "More eggs for preserving," she said slowly, working through the implications. "And chickens for meat through the cold months. Makes good sense." "That's what I figured, too." The approval in his voice sent warmth spreading through her chest like honey in hot tea. She dried her hands on the towel, acutely aware of his presence beside her in the gathering darkness, of the way his shoulder nearly touched hers as they stood side by side. A horse's hooves drummed against the hard-packed earth of the yard, the sound growing louder as the rider approached. Clara turned to see a man silhouetted against the last light of sunset, sitting his mount with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. Silas stepped protectively closer to Clara, his body tensing like a coiled spring. The easy companionship of the root cellar evaporated like morning mist. "That's Ezekiel Murphy," Silas said, his voice flat as a tombstone. The name meant nothing to Clara, but the way Silas said it made her stomach clench with sudden dread. Murphy reined his horse to a stop near the porch and touched his hat brim with mock politeness, his eyes finding Clara and lingering with an assessment that made her skin crawl like ants. "Evening, Stone," Murphy's voice carried across the yard like the crack of a whip. "Heard you got yourself a mail-order bride." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold as winter stone. How did he know? When shadows fall, Clara set down the mending she'd been working on, her needle pricking her finger in her haste. A drop of blood welled bright red against her pale skin, but she barely noticed the sting. "I'm a worker here, Mr. Murphy," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart against her ribs. Nothing more than that. Murphy's horse shifted restlessly beneath him, hooves scraping against the packed earth like fingernails on wood. The man's eyes never left Clara's face, cataloging every detail with the thoroughness of a cattle buyer examining stock at auction. "That Thomas Whitmore fella's been talking around town," Murphy continued, as if she hadn't spoken at all. "Says you ran out on your wedding contract, left him high and dry after he paid good money for your passage west." Clara's jaw muscles clenched until they ached. She could taste copper where she'd bitten her tongue to keep from responding with the fury that boiled in her chest. Silas stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body through the cooling evening air. "Clara's business is her own concern," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of warning a wise man heeded. Murphy chuckled, a sound like gravel rattling in an empty tin bucket. "Well now, that's mighty noble of you, Stone. But contracts are contracts in this territory. Man's got legal rights when he's been cheated out of what's rightfully his." The kitchen door opened behind them with a creak of hinges. Martha Stone emerged, wiping her hands on her apron with sharp, efficient movements. Her gray eyes took in the scene with the quick assessment of a woman who'd weathered 40 years on the frontier and knew trouble when it rode into her yard. "Mr. Murphy," Martha said, her voice carrying the chill of a January morning. "What brings you calling at supper time when decent folks are sitting down with their families?" "Just being neighborly. Mrs. Stone wanted to meet the young lady who's caused such a stir in town. Word travels fast in a small community." Martha positioned herself beside Clara, presenting a united front against whatever poison Murphy had come to spread. "Clara's been a blessing to this household. Works harder than most men I've had the pleasure of knowing." Murphy's smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold as creek stones in winter. "I'm sure she does. Question is, what kind of work exactly?" The insult hit Clara like a physical blow that stole the breath from her lungs. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she kept her chin raised, meeting Murphy's gaze with the direct stare her father had taught her to use with bullies. The kind that puts food on the table and keeps a house running proper. "Mr. Murphy, perhaps you should ask your wife about such things, assuming you have one who'll claim you." Murphy's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "My wife knows her place, girl." "Then she's fortunate to have found it so easily." Clara's voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut leather. "Not all of us are blessed with such clarity." The man's horse danced sideways as Murphy jerked the reins harder than necessary, leather creaking under the sudden tension. "You've got a smart mouth on you, girl. Might want to watch that tongue of yours." Silas moved forward, his hand coming to rest on the wooden porch railing. The casual gesture somehow managed to convey more threat than any raised voice could have. "I think you've said your piece, Murphy." For a moment, tension crackled between the two men like lightning before a storm, the kind of electric silence that made horses nervous and sent rabbits scurrying for their burrows. Then Murphy touched his hat brim with exaggerated courtesy that fooled no one. "Sure enough, just remember, Stone actions have consequences in a community like ours. especially when they affect the reputation of decent, God-fearing folks. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, kicking up clouds of dust that drifted across the yard in the still evening air. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving behind only the normal sounds of evening crickets chirping, cattle lowing in the pasture, the soft whisper of wind through prairie grass. Clara's hands shook as she picked up her mending. The needle trembled between her fingers, making tiny silver flashes in the lamplight that spilled from the kitchen window. A moth fluttered against the glass, drawn to the warm glow like a soul seeking salvation. "Don't let him rattle you," Martha said firmly. But Clara could see the worry lines deepening around the older woman's eyes like cracks in dried mud. Ezekiel Murphy's been a troublemaker since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. But Clara could see past Martha's brave words to the calculation happening behind her weathered features. The older woman's fingers worried at the strings of her apron, a gesture Clara had learned meant Martha was figuring costs and consequences with the precision of a banker. "He's not wrong, though," Clara said quietly, her voice barely audible above the evening sounds. "About contracts and consequences." Silas turned to face her fully, his expression sharp in the lamplight. "You don't owe Thomas Whitmore a blessed thing. He broke faith first when he left you sitting on that porch." Clara folded the shirt she'd been mending, her movements precise and controlled, as if keeping her hands busy could somehow keep her thoughts from spiraling. "It's not about what I owe him. It's about what people will believe when they hear his version." The truth of it settled over them like dust after Murphy's departure, coating everything with the grit of hard reality. In a territory where reputation mattered more than law and gossip traveled faster than the best horses, Clara's presence at the Stone Ranch had just become a liability that could cost this family everything they'd worked to build. Inside the house, Beth called that supper was getting cold, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to pretend everything was normal. Martha touched Clara's shoulder gently before heading toward the door, her calloused hand brief but warm against the worn fabric of Clara's dress. "We chose to keep you," Martha said, her voice steady as bedrock. "We stand by that choice, come what may." But as the older woman disappeared into the warm glow of the kitchen, Clara caught the tightness around her mouth, the slight stoop of shoulders carrying a burden that hadn't been there an hour ago. Silas remained on the porch, his profile sharp against the lamplight streaming from the windows. Clara studied his face, searching for signs of doubt or regret in the familiar lines and angles. "Your family doesn't deserve this trouble," she said. "My family can handle whatever comes our way." The confidence in his voice should have reassured her. Instead, it made Clara's stomach clench with a new fear. 3 days later, that fear would prove justified when she overheard Martha counting their dwindling coins at the kitchen table, her voice tight with worry as she told Beth that Jake Morrison at the feed store had started asking pointed questions about their account. But tonight, as they walked into the house for a supper that would taste like ashes in Clara's mouth, she didn't yet know that Murphy's visit was only the beginning. What she did know, with the certainty of someone who'd learned to read the signs, was that her time in this safe harbor was about to come to an end. The question was whether she'd leave voluntarily or be driven out by forces beyond her control. The darkest hour, the feed store owner's words cut through the morning air like an axe-splitting kindling. Clara pressed herself against the weathered boards of Henderson's Mercantile, her basket of eggs forgotten at her feet as the shells cracked against the wooden sidewalk. Decent customers don't want to do business with folks who harbor fallen women. Mrs. Stone. Jake Morrison's voice carried clearly across the street. Bad for a man's reputation to be seen dealing with such arrangements. Clara's fingernails bit into her palms hard enough to leave crescents of blood. Through the store window, she could see Martha Stone's shoulders stiffen like fence posts driven deep. But the older woman's reply was too quiet to catch. Clara slipped around the building's corner into the alley that reeked of rotting potatoes and horse manure. The stench made her gag, but she pressed deeper into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged animal trying to break free. The brick wall scraped against her back as she leaned against it, trying to catch her breath, when she returned to the ranch an hour later. Martha sat at the kitchen table with a small pile of coins spread before her like pieces of a broken dream. Silver and copper caught the lamplight as Martha's weathered fingers moved across them, counting and recounting with the desperate precision of someone watching their future shrink with each tally. $23.40, Martha murmured to Beth, who sat across from her with the household ledger open. That's all that's left after the bank payment and what Morrison demanded up front for the winter feed order. Clara froze in the doorway, her basket clutched against her chest so tightly the wicker left marks on her palms. The conversation died the moment Martha noticed her. But the damage was done. Clara had seen the fear in Martha's eyes, heard the strain in her voice that spoke of sleepless nights and calculations that never added up right. "Clara," Martha said, quickly sweeping the coins into her apron pocket where they clinked together like broken bells. "How did the egg selling go in town?" The lies stuck in Clara's throat like sawdust. "Fine. Mrs. Henderson took them all." But the pretense felt hollow as a rotten log. That evening, Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed and faced the truth that had been growing in her chest like a cancer. She was destroying the only family who'd ever shown her genuine kindness. Clara pulled her traveling bag from under the bed, the leather corners scraping against the rough wooden floor with a sound like claws on bark. The bag fell open, releasing the faint scent of lavender sachets her sister had tucked between her spare dress and undergarments back in Ohio, a lifetime ago when she still believed in promises written in pretty letters. Her fingers shook as she folded the dark wool dress, the fabric thin as tissue paper from too many washings and too many miles traveled in coaches that smelled of other people's desperation. She placed her Bible on top, the leather cover worn smooth from her father's hands, and then her own. The farewell letter took 4 attempts. The first was too angry, full of accusations against Thomas Whitmore and the unfairness of a world that punished women for men's failures. The second groveled like a beaten dog, self-pitying in a way that made bile rise in her throat. The third tried to explain the economics of reputation and the mathematics of gossip. The fourth simply told the truth. "Dear Martha, Silas, and Beth, thank you for showing me what family means when it's built on choice rather than blood. I cannot repay that gift with anything but heartache. But I can prevent my presence from destroying what you have built with your own hands and honest sweat. A woman's reputation is like a broken mirror once cracked. It spreads its damage to everything it reflects. Please know that leaving is the hardest thing I have ever done. But staying would be the cruelest. With deepest gratitude and love. Clara." She folded the letter with hands that trembled like autumn leaves and left it on the small wooden table beside her bed. The candle flame danced in the draught from the ill-fitting window, casting writhing shadows on the walls that looked like demons come to witness her surrender. Clara was latching her traveling bag when the door swung open without a knock. Silas filled the doorway, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it, his shirt buttoned wrong like he'd dressed in haste. "What in blazes do you think you're doing?" The bag's brass corners caught the candlelight as Clara turned to face him, her spine straight despite the weight crushing down on her shoulders. "What needs doing? Running never solved a blessed thing. Staying hurts people who showed me kindness I didn't deserve." Clara's voice cracked on the last word like ice breaking up in spring. "I heard Morrison at the feed store. I saw your mother counting coins like they were her last meal on earth." Silas stepped inside and closed the door behind him with a soft click that seemed loud as thunder. The small room suddenly felt cramped, filled with his presence and the smell of horses and honest work that always surrounded him like an invisible coat. "So you're going to let fear win? Let that snake Murphy and his poisoned tongue drive you away from the first place you've belonged since you left Ohio." The accusation hit her like a slap across the face. Clara's spine stiffened, and she lifted her chin to meet his eyes with all the defiance she could muster. "I'm choosing to protect the people who protected me, when I had nothing to offer in return. By abandoning them when they need you most. By removing the cause of their troubles before those troubles destroy everything they've worked to build." Silas moved closer, close enough that she could see the lamplight reflected in his dark eyes, close enough to smell the soap he'd used for washing and the coffee on his breath from supper. "And what if we don't want you to go? What if we'd rather face whatever comes than lose what we've found?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with implications that made Clara's carefully constructed resolve waver like a house built on sand. She felt cracks appearing in her certainty, doubts creeping in through the spaces between her convictions. A sharp knock on the door shattered the moment like a stone through window glass. Martha Stone's voice carried through the wood, tight with an urgency that Clara had never heard from the unflappable woman who'd survived 4 decades on the frontier. "Silas, Clara, you need to come to the main house, right now." Martha Stone was not a woman given to dramatics or false alarms. When she said now, she meant that waiting even 30 seconds could mean the difference between disaster and salvation. They found her in the kitchen, standing beside the table where the household ledger lay open like a confession. Beth sat in her chair, her face pale as milk in the lamplight, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white as bone. "Sit down," Martha said, gesturing to the remaining chairs with the authority of a general deploying troops. "Both of you." Clara remained standing, her traveling bag still clutched in her hand like a shield between herself and whatever blow was coming. Martha's eyes fixed on the bag with the accuracy of a hawk spotting prey from 1,000 feet up. "Planning to run out on us? Were you—" Clara's throat closed like a fist around her voice. She nodded once, sharp and quick as a bird pecking grain. Martha Stone placed both hands flat on the scrubbed wooden table and leaned forward like a judge about to pronounce sentence. "Well, you can stop planning right there. This family has something to say about that notion." She opened the ledger to a page covered in Beth's careful handwriting, columns of numbers marching down the paper in neat rows like soldiers prepared for battle. Clara couldn't focus on the details. Her vision had started to blur at the edges as if she were looking through water. "We've been keeping track," Martha continued, her voice steady as bedrock, "of everything you've contributed to this household since you arrived. The eggs you've sold, the preserves you've made, the mending you've done for neighbors who pay in coins and chickens." Beth calculated it all. Beth cleared her throat like a sparrow finding its voice. $21.35 in the first month alone. That's not counting the money we've saved by having your help with the household work and not needing to hire temporary help for preserving season. Clara stared at the ledger, the numbers swimming before her eyes like tadpoles in a pond. "I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." "I'm telling you that you've more than earned your keep," Martha said with the firmness of someone driving nails into hard wood. "But that's not the point, and never was. The point is this: what matters more, what neighbors think, or who we are when nobody's watching." Silence filled the kitchen except for the tick of the mantel clock and the soft hiss of the kerosene lamp that had burned low enough to need trimming. Clara felt tears threatening behind her eyes and blinked them back with the fury of someone who'd cried enough tears to fill a river. Martha straightened to her full height, which wasn't considerable but somehow seemed to fill the entire room. "I'm calling a family meeting. Right here. Right now. And your family. Clara Whitfield. Whether you've got sense enough to see it or not." She reached for the family Bible that sat on the kitchen shelf, its leather cover worn smooth by 3 generations of stone hands. "This family votes on everything that matters to our future. And you staying or going matters more than anything we've faced since the fever took my boy." Clara's traveling bag slipped from her nerveless fingers and hit the floor with a sound like hope dying. "All in favor of Clara staying? Consequences be hanged. Raise your hands." 3 hands shot up without hesitation. Martha's gnarled with arthritis, but steady as stone. Beth's smaller, but no less determined. And Silas's scarred from years of ranch work, but raised high as a flag of defiance. Clara stood frozen, staring at those raised hands like they were foreign objects she'd never seen before in her life. "Motion carried," Martha said with satisfaction thick as honey. "You're staying, and that's the end of it." But even as relief flooded through Clara's chest like water through a broken dam, a new sound reached her ears through the kitchen window, the drumming of horse hooves in the yard outside, growing closer and more urgent with each passing heartbeat. Through the gingham curtains, Clara caught sight of a rider approaching at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cool evening air. The man wore something on his vest that caught the lamplight and threw it back like a mirror. A badge. And riding behind him, barely visible in the darkness, came 2 more shapes that made Clara's blood turn to ice in her veins. One of them was Thomas Whitmore. The other was Ezekiel Murphy. And he was grinning like a wolf who'd finally cornered his prey. Standing together, the badge on the rider's vest caught the moonlight as he dismounted with the practiced efficiency of a lawman who'd made such calls before. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb's boots hit the ground with a dull thump, dust rising around his spurs like ghosts in the lamplight that spilled from the kitchen windows. "Evening, folks," Webb called, touching the brim of his hat with professional courtesy. "Looking for Clara Whitfield." Martha Stone stepped onto the porch, positioning herself between Clara and the deputy like a she-bear protecting her cub. "What business do you have with her at this hour?" "Deputy." Webb pulled a folded document from his vest pocket, the territorial seal visible even in the poor light. The paper crackled as he unfolded it with deliberate slowness. "Got a formal complaint filed by Thomas Whitmore. Says Miss Whitfield violated a legal marriage contract and absconded with property belonging to him." Clara's legs trembled beneath her skirts like saplings in a windstorm. She gripped the porch railing to keep from swaying, the wood rough and splintered under her palms. "I violated nothing. He never came to meet me as the contract specified. That's for Judge Hamilton to decide." "Miss..." Webb squinted at the document in the lamplight, his weathered face creased with the expression of a man who'd rather be home with his own family. "Says here you're to appear before the territorial court in Cedar Ridge tomorrow at 10 o'clock sharp." The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one driving the breath from her lungs. Her vision tunneled until she could see nothing but the deputy's weathered face and the official paper in his hands that might as well have been her death warrant. "And if she doesn't appear?" Silas asked, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Webb's hand drift toward his sidearm. "Then I'll be back with a warrant for her arrest." Webb refolded the paper with military precision. "Nothing personal, you understand. Just doing my job as the law requires." Behind the deputy, Thomas Whitmore sat his horse like a conquering general, his hair slicked back with pomade that gleamed in the moonlight. Even in the darkness, Clara could see the satisfaction on his face, the cold calculation of a man who believed he'd finally cornered his quarry. Ezekiel Murphy remained mounted beside Whitmore, his presence unnecessary except for the obvious pleasure he took in watching the drama unfold. His teeth showed white in the darkness as he grinned at Clara's distress. After the 3 men rode away, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth like the beating of death drums, Clara sank onto the porch steps with her knees drawn up to her chest. Her hands shook so violently she had to clasp them together to still the trembling that seemed to come from her very bones. "I have to go," she whispered to the night air. "I have to face him in that courtroom." Martha sat beside her, the wooden step creaking under their combined weight. The older woman's presence was solid and warm in the cooling air. Not alone, You don't. This family stands together, come hell or high water." The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with clouds hanging low enough to touch the chimney tops. Clara stood before her small mirror, pinning her hair with fingers that refused to remain steady. The face staring back at her looked hollow-eyed and pale as milk, but her chin was set with the determination of a woman who'd already lost everything once and survived to tell about it. She had chosen her best dress, the dark blue wool with pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender water and pressed flowers, scents that carried her back to better times when such dresses were worn to church socials and afternoon teas instead of territorial courtrooms. Martha appeared in the doorway, holding a paisley shawl that looked old enough to have crossed the plains in a covered wagon. "This belonged to my mother," she said simply. "Wore it to my own wedding 42 years ago." Clara's throat tightened as Martha draped the shawl around her shoulders with the care of a mother dressing her daughter for her first dance. The wool was soft as a whisper, warm as an embrace from someone who'd been dead for 20 years. They walked into Cedar Ridge as a family, Martha on Clara's right, Beth on her left. Silas behind them, with his shoulders squared for battle and his Sunday coat brushed clean of dust. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, and Clara could feel eyes watching from every window and doorway like vultures waiting for carrion. The courthouse was a simple wooden building with a bell tower and American flag hanging limp in the still air. Judge Hamilton's courtroom occupied the entire first floor, with wooden benches arranged in neat rows facing a raised platform where justice was supposed to be dispensed with equal measure to rich and poor alike. Thomas Whitmore sat in the front row, his suit pressed to knife-sharp creases and his boots polished to a mirror shine. When Clara entered on Silas's arm, Whitmore turned to stare at her with the cold assessment of a man cataloging his property before taking possession. "Miss Whitfield," Judge Hamilton's voice boomed from behind his wooden desk, making Clara jump like a startled cat. "You stand accused of breach of contract and theft of property. How do you answer these charges?" Clara rose on legs that felt weak as water. Her voice came out as barely a whisper that wouldn't have carried to the second row. "Not guilty, Your Honor." "Speak up, miss. This court can't hear mumblings and whispers." Clara cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the words past the constriction that felt like a noose around her neck. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Whitmore's lawyer, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the pale complexion of someone who spent his days bent over legal documents, stood to present their case. He read from the marriage contract with theatrical emphasis, pointing out each clause Clara had supposedly violated with the dramatic flair of an actor playing to the gallery. "The defendant agreed to marry Mr. Whitmore upon arrival in Cedar Ridge," the lawyer declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "She has been living unmarried with another family for over a month, in clear violation of her contractual obligations and moral duties as a Christian woman." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom like wind through wheat. Clara felt heat flood her cheeks as neighbors she'd tried to befriend turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval to outright condemnation. "Miss Whitfield," Judge Hamilton said, his voice carrying the weight of territorial authority, "do you have legal representation?" Clara's mouth opened, but no words came. She had no money for a lawyer, no legal knowledge to defend herself against documents and precedents, and the weight of territorial law that seemed designed to crush women like grain between millstones. "I'll speak for her." Every head in the courtroom turned as if pulled by invisible strings. Martha Stone stood in the gallery, her gray hair pinned back severely. Her weathered hands clutched around her reticule like weapons of war. "Ma'am, you're not qualified under territorial law to," Judge Hamilton began. But Martha's voice cut through his objection like an axe through kindling. "I'm qualified to speak God's truth, Your Honor." And the truth is that Thomas Whitmore abandoned this woman at the train station like a piece of unwanted baggage, left her with no money, no shelter, and no explanation for 3 days while decent folks walked past her like she was already dead. Whitmore jumped to his feet, his face flushing red above his starched collar. That's a damnable lie. I was delayed by urgent business matters that couldn't be postponed. 3 days of business matters. Martha's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade forged in righteous fire. While a decent woman sat hungry on a store porch with nothing but the clothes on her back, and 3 pennies to her name. Clara watched in amazement as Martha Stone, quiet, reserved Martha, who rarely raised her voice above a conversational tone, transformed into an avenging angel defending her adopted daughter with the fury of someone who'd seen too much injustice in 40 years of frontier life. Furthermore, Martha continued, her voice ringing off the courthouse walls, Clara Whitfield has conducted herself with nothing but dignity and honest work while residing at our ranch. She's earned every penny of her keep and more through labor that would break the back of most men in this courtroom. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as neighbors who'd known Martha Stone for years saw her in a new light. Clara spotted Mrs. Henderson nodding approvingly from the 3rd row, and old Mr. Peterson leaning forward to listen more closely to every word. Judge Hamilton rapped his gavel against his desk with sharp, decisive strikes. Order in this court. He studied Clara with tired eyes that had seen too many cases like this one. Miss Whitfield, is it true that Mr. Whitmore failed to meet you as arranged? Yes, Your Honor. I waited 3 days at Henderson's Mercantile. He never came, sent no word, provided no explanation for his absence. And you've been working for your room and board at the Stone Ranch? Yes, sir. Honest work for honest wages. Judge Hamilton turned his attention to Whitmore, his expression skeptical as a banker examining a suspicious loan application. Mr. Whitmore, can you explain your 3-day absence to this court? Whitmore's face flushed darker, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. I had pressing business matters to attend to. A man can't drop everything just because he made a legal commitment to a woman who traveled 1,500 miles to honor her part of an agreement. Judge Hamilton's eyebrows rose like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. That's exactly what a man should do, sir. The courtroom fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the scratch of the court clerk's pen recording every word for posterity. Clara held her breath, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that justice might actually be possible in a world that seemed designed to crush women like her. Judge Hamilton shuffled through the papers on his desk with deliberate slowness, each rustle sounding loud as thunder in the hushed courtroom. This court finds that the marriage contract was voided by the plaintiff's failure to fulfill his primary obligations. Miss Whitfield is free to make her own choices about her future. The gavel's bang echoed through the room like the crack of Judgment Day. Clara's knees gave out, and she sank back into her chair as relief flooded through her like water breaking through a dam. Around her, she heard Martha's quiet "Praise the Lord," and Beth's relieved sigh that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. But as the courtroom began to empty, people filing out to discuss the morning's drama over coffee and speculation, Clara noticed something that made her stomach clench with new dread. Thomas Whitmore hadn't left with the others. Instead, he stood near the back door with his lawyer. Both men's faces twisted with expressions that promised this defeat was only the beginning, not the end. And beside them, grinning like a coyote who'd found a wounded sheep, stood Ezekiel Murphy. Whatever they were planning, Clara realized with growing horror, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Harvest moon and new beginnings. 3 weeks after the courthouse victory, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching Silas repair the chicken coop fence in the golden light of late afternoon. His hammer rang against the wooden posts in steady rhythm, each blow driving the nails deeper into the weathered pine with the satisfaction of work done right. The autumn air carried the sweet scent of ripe apples from the orchard, and the earthy smell of turned soil from the fields where they'd finished harvesting the last of the wheat. Harvest season had arrived with its familiar promise of abundance and the quiet satisfaction of survival earned through honest labor. Martha entered the kitchen carrying a basket of brown eggs still warm from the nest, her cheeks flushed from the morning chill that warned of winter's approach. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by while you were gathering the last of the preserving peaches," she said, setting the basket on the scrubbed wooden counter. "Wants to know if you'd consider teaching her youngest daughter to read before the snow flies." Clara turned from the window, flour dusting her hands from the bread dough she'd been kneading for tomorrow's baking. The yeast mixture bubbled gently in its ceramic bowl, alive and growing like hope itself. "Mrs. Henderson asked for me specifically. Said she'd heard you were a proper teacher back in Ohio before your troubles began. Figures her Sarah could use some schooling before winter sets in, and keeps everyone housebound for months." Martha's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Word's getting around that you know your letters better than most." The simple request sent warmth spreading through Clara's chest like honey stirred into hot tea. Mrs. Henderson had been one of the first to approach her after the trial, offering friendship where others had offered only whispered judgment and sideways glances. "I'd be honored to help Sarah," Clara said, returning to her bread dough with renewed energy. The mixture yielded under her hands, smooth and elastic with the promise of tomorrow's fresh loaves. Through the window, she watched Silas test the repaired fence post, putting his full weight against it to check its stability. The post held firm against his shoulder. He looked up, caught her watching, and touched the brim of his hat, an acknowledgement that made her pulse quicken like a schoolgirl's. Her hands stilled in the dough as she realized how much had changed since that first night on Henderson's porch. Then she'd been a woman with nothing but 3 pennies and empty promises. Now she stood in a kitchen that smelled of home, surrounded by people who'd chosen to keep her when the world demanded they cast her out. That evening, after supper dishes were cleared and Martha had settled with her mending beside the fire, Clara found herself on the front porch swing. The wooden seat creaked gently as she pushed it into motion with her toe, the sound peaceful as a lullaby in the gathering dusk. Silas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag that smelled of leather oil and honest work. He'd been preparing harness for the final trips to town before winter closed the roads with snow and ice. He climbed the porch steps and stood beside the swing, his hands resting on the whitewashed railing that Martha painted fresh every spring. "Mind if I sit a spell?" Clara scooted over to make room, her skirts rustling against the wooden seat. The swing dipped under his weight, bringing them close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Above them, the harvest moon hung full and golden, casting silver light across the yard where chickens pecked at scattered grain. "Been thinking about more than just expanding the chicken coop," Silas said quietly, his voice barely audible above the evening sounds of crickets and distant cattle. "Maybe adding a room to the main house, a proper parlor where you could do your teaching when the weather turns cold." Clara's hands stilled in her lap, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of her skirt. "That's a considerable expense for a family still recovering from hard times. Good investment. Territory needs teachers, and you're better qualified than most of the folks who claim the title." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts like a man preparing to jump across a wide creek. "Besides, a man ought to provide proper for his wife." The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, heavy with implications that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. She turned to study his profile in the moonlight, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar where it needed cutting. Silas. His name felt different on her tongue tonight, weighted with possibilities she hardly dared consider. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in faded velvet that looked older than the territory itself. His fingers trembled slightly as he unwrapped it, revealing a simple gold band that caught the moonlight like captured starfire. "This was my grandmother's ring," he said, holding it up between them with the reverence of a man handling something sacred. "Belonged to her mother before that, and her mother's mother before her. Been waiting in that drawer for the right woman to wear it. Clara's breath caught as she reached out to touch the ring with one fingertip. The gold was warm despite the cooling air, worn smooth by decades of wear, shaped by the hands of women who had loved and worked and built lives from nothing but determination and faith. I'm not asking you to marry me out of gratitude or because you think you owe this family something. Silas continued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I'm asking because somewhere between sharing that first supper on Henderson's porch and watching you stand up to Thomas Whitmore in that courtroom, I realized I don't want to imagine my life without you in it. Clara studied his face in the golden light, searching for any trace of pity or obligation. She found neither. Instead, she saw the same steady certainty she'd come to associate with everything Silas Stone did, the same careful consideration he gave to mending fence posts or planning crop rotations, or any task that mattered to the future. As partners, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the night sounds. Not as someone who needs rescuing. Silas's mouth quirked up in the half-smile she'd grown to love more than her next breath. Partners. You never needed rescuing. Clara Whitfield. You rescued yourself that first night when you chose dignity over begging. All I did was provide a place to sit while you figured out your next move. She looked down at the ring, then back at his face, seeing her future written in the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. Yes, she said simply, the word carrying more weight than all the legal documents and contracts in the territorial courthouse. Silas slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook only slightly. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along, as if 3 generations of Stone women had worn it just to prepare it for this moment. Through the kitchen window, Clara caught a glimpse of Martha and Beth embracing, their faces bright with joy barely contained. She laughed, realizing they'd been watching from inside like conspirators planning a surprise. Spring wedding, Silas asked, his voice rough with emotion that made her chest tighten with happiness. Spring wedding, Clara agreed, the words tasting sweet as honey on her tongue, as if summoned by their voices. Martha and Beth emerged onto the porch, followed by the sound of a cork popping from a bottle that Martha had been saving for special occasions. The elderberry wine caught the moonlight in their glasses as they raised them in celebration. To new beginnings, Martha said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a woman who'd chosen right. To family, Beth added, her smile bright as the harvest moon above them. To finding home where you least expect it, Clara said softly, her voice thick with gratitude for these people who'd taken her in when she had nothing to offer but willing hands and a grateful heart. They drank in the moonlight. 4 people who had become family through choice rather than blood, bound together by something stronger than legal contracts or social expectations. Later, after Martha and Beth had retired to their beds, Clara and Silas remained on the swing, planning their future with the quiet contentment of people who had found exactly where they belonged. Clara looked out across the moonlit fields, the wheat stubble silver in the pale light, the apple trees heavy with fruit that would see them through winter, the sturdy buildings that would shelter them through whatever storms might come. For the first time since leaving Ohio with nothing but promises and hope, she felt the deep satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where the Lord intended her to be. I love you, Silas Stone, she said, the words falling as naturally as rain after drought. I love you too, Clara, more than I ever thought my heart could hold. Above them, the harvest moon continued its ancient journey across the star-scattered sky, blessing their new beginning with golden light and the promise of seasons yet to come. In the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, marking time in a world where 2 lonely souls had found each other against all odds. And in that moment, sitting on a porch swing under an endless sky, Clara knew that sometimes the best promises are the ones we make to ourselves to choose hope over fear, love over loneliness, and faith over doubt. The future stretched before them like an unplowed field, full of possibilities and seasons yet to be planted. But tonight, under the watchful eye of the harvest moon, it was enough to sit together and know that whatever came next, they would face it as partners, as equals, as two hearts that had found their way home. Connecting communities. This story of Clara and Silas was born from a simple belief that has guided my own life, that in our hardest moments, ordinary kindness can become extraordinary grace. I drew inspiration from countless tales of frontier resilience, where strangers became family and shared meals built bridges stronger than any law or contract could forge. Their journey reminds us that belonging isn't about where we're born, but where we choose to plant our roots and tend them with honest work and open hearts. Clara found her home not through rescue, but through proving her worth one day at a time. Silas discovered love not through grand gestures, but through quiet respect and the recognition of an equal partner. In today's world, we often forget the power of a simple invitation to the supper table, of standing beside someone when gossip threatens to tear them down. The Stone family's choice to support Clara despite community pressure reflects the best of American values, judging character over circumstance, choosing compassion over conformity. This is a work of fiction inspired by Western frontier stories, created solely for entertainment purposes. The story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.